I was born in Maryland in the autumn of '99. My biological father, Kenneth Digman, was never a part of the picture, so I was raised by my mother and stepfather. But after a falling out with my family in the spring of 2019, I was left to fend for myself, financially and otherwise. Striking out on my own with little to no prospects, I decided to get back in touch with my biological father. It didn't take long for me to learn he had passed away a few years ago. To get to know him better, and because I lacked any direction in life, I decided to seek out what remained, to see who he was and what he did. Turns out my father was a man of many regrets. He'd been in and out of jail dozens of times. He was a known alcoholic, a thief, and hadn't kept a job for longer than a few weeks. He was, to all intents and purposes, an unapologetic failure. But I knew that couldn't be the full story. I looked up his closest living relative, a half-brother named John Digman. A sort of uncle, I guess. He was a pain in the ass to find. He was registered on a dozen addresses, under different names, in different states. Every lead just took me to another throwaway account, an empty lot. Some unknown nobody who'd been slipped a 20 and told to shut up. This was a man who didn't want to be found. That is, until I found myself in Tomskog, Minnesota. The first time I met John Digman was at a corner pub in central Tomskog. The kind of place that'd been run by the same people for 30 years, and who'd only taken on the place as a favor for the last person who ran it for 30 years. These were solid, salt-of-the-earth kind of people. So when two strangers stepped in to order a plate of nachos and a couple of beers, I couldn't help but wonder what was going on. But apart from that, we were alone. John was in his early 40s. He had long dark hair and streaks of silver running along his ears. He was clean-shaven, had a trucker cap that promoted safety, and unassuming earth-colored clothes. He was tall, thin as a stick, and kept wearing sunglasses even in the dark. This was my long-lost uncle. "So, about your dad," he said, rolling a toothpick between his fingers. "You sure you want to know?" "Yeah," I nodded. "I've heard some bad stuff." "You haven't heard half of it." "Then it's about time someone told me." John nodded. He snapped the toothpick in two, using one half to clean his fingernails and the other to pick his teeth. "Look," he said, "Keith was your father, in a way. I didn't spend a lot of time with him these past 10 years, but I got a few emails every now and then. Can't I just ask you stuff about him?" "Sure," he shrugged. "Ask away." We got our orders, a plate of nachos, olives, some cheese, and 2 beers. John just poked around the plate, not grabbing anything, while I horked it all like I was in a race. "So," I asked, in between bites, "how did he die?" "That's probably the most complicated question you could have asked me." He told me about the conversation he'd had with my father not long before he died. The story went a little something like this. The reason for Keith Digman to come to Tomskog was a last-ditch effort. He was disease-ridden, regretful, and desperate. He had nothing to his name, and all he wanted was an honest chance to make things right. Turns out, there is a place in Tomskog that is historically unique. Some of the early settlers used to travel there, as it was the only nearby town that had something resembling a church. But it also drew other crowds, of other faiths. One group of Scandinavian settlers had a particular ritual that they would perform there, called the Yearwalk. It was a sort of contract between the natural and the unnatural. On New Year's Eve, you could walk counterclockwise around the local church 12 times, one for each month. If you did, you would renounce your Christian faith for a year. That meant an entire year as a faithless outcast, ripe for the picking by any demon or ghoul that could find your immortal soul. However, if you made it through the entire year, your strife would be rewarded. So, what would you get? I asked. Gotta be something big. You get a wish. So, whatever you want? Whatever you want. I could see how that would be tempting for someone like Keith. A chance to make it all right, to set things straight. Anyone desperate enough just might do it. So, what happened? I think he went through with it, nodded John. And then he died. I ended up finishing the entire nacho plate on my own. John sipped his beer, but didn't finish it. I could tell why he was so scrawny. The guy had no appetite. We talked about the way Keith used to be. His years in high school, his likes and losses. How he loved to blast Kiss classics, driving his pride and joy, a 68 Frog Eye Spirit. He had been an open, kind, and honest man once upon a time. As the day turned to midnight, we ended up taking a walk around a nearby lake. John pointed out something interesting. This is where the church used to be, by the way, he said, pointing at the lake. There was a sinkhole at the turn of the century, dragging it all down to the bottom. There's a church at the bottom of the lake? I chuckled. Then why is it named Frog Lake? Believe me, the frogs are more interesting, grinned John. As we said our goodbyes, I got a firm handshake from him. His hands were ice cold, and I got a glimpse of his eyes under those sunglasses, bloodshot, with void black irises. I think I get what you're planning to do, he said, and I'm not here to tell you what to do. But if you want to do this, take it seriously. Some things are out of your control. You believe this is real? I asked. You think the Yearwalk really killed him? You'd be surprised how things really work when you get into the nitty-gritty, he shrugged. We said our goodbyes and went our separate ways. As we did, he called out to me. If you need me, just give me a call. Strange. His number was on my phone, but I didn't remember saving it. That night I thought about my estranged father. Keith had an idea of what kind of life he wanted to live, but something happened along the way. Maybe it was his own fault. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, it seemed cruel for things to end like they did. A lonely man wandering around a freezing lake on New Year's Eve, asking the world for a favor. I decided I would make the Yearwalk in his place and ask whatever powers that be to show him mercy. Maybe give him a second chance. Somewhere, somehow. All good intentions. I stayed in Tomskog for a while. I got a part-time job at a local warehouse and rented a small apartment on the outskirts of town. I barely had enough to make ends meet, but the place was small and the rent was cheap. The landlord, a woman in her late 40s, insisted I take the place at a discount. Nice lady, but I'm not used to people being nice. Not that nice, at least. November turned to December. By the time New Year's Eve was coming about, I had almost forgotten why I stayed in the first place. I'd gotten to know a few people around town and made some friends at work. Just casual banter between acquaintances, but they were good people. They invited me to a New Year's Eve party, and I felt like an idiot when I declined. I'd check out the path, and walking one whole lap around Frog Lake took at least 40 minutes. I'd need most of the day to get all 12. But this was my goodbye to Keith Digman. In a way, a send-off. New Year's eventually came about. People were celebrating all over town, even in the early afternoon. I could hear cheers and fireworks going up from every street downtown, but I kept walking further and further away. As the cheers died down, I was left with the crunch of snow and gravel, walking the path of Frog Lake. All right, old man, I sighed. I hope you get your wish. I started walking. It was a convenient road that circled the entire lake. It was lined with streetlights, half of which were broken. There were offshoots along the path leading to hiking trails, and lights from a dozen houses peeking through the pine forest. A few sections of the path were lined with white picket fence. I started around 4 p.m. and figured all 12 laps would be done by midnight. It might take me a little longer than expected, but if I finished early, I could pop by the corner pub for a drink on my way home. I could use the warmth. Minnesota winters can be brutal. The first lap went without a hitch. I was listening to a podcast and just enjoying the scenery. These old towns have that certain something that not many places have. That feeling of people having really lived there. Not just being there, but lived there. Names carved into trees, a broken bicycle thrown into the woods, a handmade sign with a Bible quote about snakes in paradise. You could tell there were a lot of memories in these trails. The second lap, I ate a sandwich. Not that exciting. Had to throw away the pickles. They had gone black seemingly overnight. Not that appetizing. By the third lap, I stopped to stretch near a clearing in the forest. I could imagine the place to be beautiful in the summer. There was a lavender farm north of there, and you could probably smell it all the way here. By the fourth lap, I was ready to call it quits. I'd been walking for 2 hours, and I was starting to ask myself what the hell I was doing. It was then that I noticed I got a text, just minutes earlier, from John. "You sure about this?" it read. It was a hard question to answer. I didn't know if I was sure or not. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I wanted to do it. I didn't respond, but I somehow got the feeling that he already knew my answer. I got into the zone. I just kept walking as the sky turned darker and darker. Lap 4, 5, 6, they all just passed me by. After a while, the podcast was finished, and I didn't even notice. I just kept walking. The sound of fireworks grew stronger, and I met some early celebrators walking the same trail as me. Some of them waved, others just hurried off to where they were going. No one else was doing the Yearwalk, it seemed. But I was feeling strange. maybe I was just tired or dizzy, but it felt like I had been walking for ages. My feet were doing it automatically, like I'd forgotten how to stop. It was an out-of-body experience, and I felt myself drifting off into a thoughtless wander. The night grew darker, briefly illuminated by exploding lights, little snaps lighting up the sky, as if to pull me out of my trance, to wake me up. Maybe that's what they're really there for. As I started the final lap, I could feel my feet growing heavy. I was cold, exhausted, and hungry, more so than usual. This was taking a heavier toll than I anticipated. And I'm not that out of shape. Still, I couldn't stop now. One more lap, and I was done. But everything looked different in the dark. The shadows grew longer, and all the little quirks along the path seemed more threatening. It felt like a warning of things to come. The fireworks would cast long shadows, making it look like shapes moving through the trees. I'd hear cracks in the frozen lake, as if something underneath was probing for weakness. I heard laughter in the woods. There was a foul stench coming from a house. Black footsteps leading into an open field. Shards of broken mirrors scattered across the path. And at the very end of the line, a dried blue sunflower hanging from a broken streetlight. Had I just not seen any of it? Or had it been there all along? What the hell kind of town was this? I took that final step, closing the circle. 12 laps. A complete year walk. I resigned my faith and surrendered to whatever powers may be for a promise of a wish fulfilled. I felt like an idiot. A superstitious idiot. I wasn't going to the corner pub. No way. I was going home for a shower and sleep for 12 hours straight. I stumbled up 3 flights of stairs, no elevator, and barely made it through the door. I dropped my jacket on the floor, locked the front door, and collapsed on the toilet. It took me at least 20 minutes to build up the strength to get undressed. I had never been that tired. My body ached, and I felt at least 60 pounds heavier. I finally managed to get in the shower. One of those combined bathtub shower combos. Nothing fancy, but I enjoyed a few evenings there. But that night, I just wanted to get clean and collapse on my bed. The water was cold and smelled strange. I just stood there with my eyes closed, half asleep. I didn't care enough to step out of the cold. I just wanted to get it over with. I opened my eyes and looked up, only to see the water turn black. And in that moment, the lights went out. I thought I'd gotten something in my eye, but no matter how hard I rinsed, the room stayed dark. There was an awful rumbling sound coming from the pipes as the water turned into a thick sludge. It had this powerful chemical stench, like a mix of acetone and raw rubber. I stepped out of the shower, trying to find my towel in the dark. I could feel specks of dirt on my skin and a thin layer sticking to my skin as I wiped myself dry. I'd have to shower again once the lights came back on. I tried to find my phone to turn on the flashlight, but I'd left it in the hallway. I fumbled for the door handle, put my hand on it, and stopped. There was a shuffling noise in the other room. Despite being so tired, I could barely move my legs. I felt ready to run. Like something primal in me put a cold hand around my spine, urging me to pay attention. There was something in the other room, and it was a threat. "Little wheat," a voice came through the door. "Have you come for the harvest?" The voice pierced the door and curled into my ear, making me twinge with unease. If I could get the door open, I'd be able to reach my phone and call for help. But something in me wanted to just hold my breath and disappear. "Have you grown tired of dance and drink, little wheat? Have you grown tall and nurturing? Please, just leave. I don't want to call the police." "Leave?" It laughed. The shuffling noise grew louder as something shot through the room. In the blink of an eye, I felt the door buckle as something heavy pressed against it. "You asked me to come, little wheat. Why would I leave?" I didn't even notice I was doing it. I was backing into the corner, holding up my hands, repeating, "No, no, no," to myself like a mantra. It was as if something inside of me had snapped and taken control, and I was just listening from the sidelines. Whatever was on the other side of that door was here to do something awful to me. "Little wheat, your purpose is clear. Whether you feed my children now or later is irrelevant. Your perception is flawed." I didn't know what to say. I had to do something. I scrambled into the bathtub and turned the shower back on, hoping it couldn't hear me over the rushing water. Sadly, all I got was that thick sludge. Foul-smelling, viscous chunks dripping on my cold shoulder. "I'm coming in." The door buckled and shattered into pieces. I screamed. Like a balloon, I let all the air out of my lungs and just screamed. Something huge slithered across the floor, barely squeezing into the bathroom, struggling against the door frame. The voice came from the ceiling as the head struggled to fit. The shower curtains were torn down, and something cold and scaly slithered up my leg. "There you are." An impossibly muscular appendage wrapped around my chest and pulled me up against the cold ceramic tiles. I bumped my head against the ceiling. It squeezed my chest, pressing the last screams out of me. Even in the dark of the bathroom, I felt the world grow darker. The voice came closer. "You are fulfilling your purpose. It stopped. A rough tongue, longer than my forearm, pressed against my face. I could feel my skin straining to stay on, as little cuts formed on my forehead and scalp. A moment later, it dropped me like a bag of hammers. I came down hard, landing on my tailbone and bending my left wrist at a bad angle. Tired, hurt, and cold, with this thing looming over me. There was a short pause, as it pondered what to do. Maybe it just liked to hear me suffer. "You're rotten," it hissed. "Bad wheat. What sort of soil were you grown in?" I heard something whip back and forth. A crackle of ceramic tiles shattered, the bathroom mirror breaking, and the bathroom sink falling to pieces. "Disgusting!" it shrieked. Disgusting! Disgusting wheat! The lights came back on, and for a split second, I saw it. An enormous, slithering creature, like a transparent snake, full to the brim with twisted bodies and broken skulls. A cranium resembling 6 faces smushed into a single head like a parody of theatrical masks. Shimmering, razor-sharp scales, a stroke of which might cut me into pieces. Countless little appendages, elongated arms, sticking unceremoniously out of bald spots on its skin. It lunged, wanting to devour me whole, but it stopped itself. A warm breath touched my face, as it realized I was inedible. It knew this, and yet it had a want, a need. Looking into 2 of its eyes, I saw only hatred. A hatred and a promise of terrible things to come. Then it was just gone, with the blink of an eye, leaving me broken and crying in the bathtub. I was lying there in a pool of black goo. The entire bathroom smelled like a chemical plant. There was another rumble in the pipes, as the sludge was washed away with warm, refreshing water. I just looked at the mess. The door, the mirror, the sink. Half the apartment was in disarray. The thing had just appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as fast. Maybe the sludge had protected me in a way, but it felt like I'd just changed one awful thing for another. I was choking on the gut-wrenching smell. It wasn't long after midnight that I found myself leaning out of my kitchen window, gasping for air as the fireworks exploded overhead. Happy New Year. A few days passed before I met John Digman at the corner pub again. He'd ordered me a nacho plate and a beer, not even pretending to get something for himself. I sat down, wincing as my left wrist moved a bit too much. "You look like shit," John smiled. "What happened? You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "I'm not sure about that." I don't know," I said. "I think I'm fucked. I'm done." "You met something, didn't you?" I just looked at him. He peered out from under his sunglasses, as his eyes gave off a red sheen. There were little details about him that I hadn't seen. His hair, for instance. It was just white. It had streaks of literal silver, little cables. "You made it further than your dad ever did," he said, "but you got a long way to go if you're gonna make it to the next year."